So in that gospel reading, Jesus confronts a whole raft of ways of understanding religion and money and the temple and so on. And it was last week's gospel reading, but I thought it was a great introduction to this sermon in our series on holy habits, talking about the Christian discipline or habit of giving. Because in that reading, Jesus confronts first of all, a commercial mindset that sees the temple primarily in terms of being something that's costly and valuable. You know, it's been under construction for 46 years, don't you know? Think how much stone and mortar and labour that's taken. And he also confronts a kind of commercial mindset that sees the temple as an opportunity for money-making enterprise. Alongside that, he confronts a purity mindset that sees only certain things as being holy enough for God. That's the basis, that's the rationale for the money changers and the sellers of cows and so on being there in the first place. Your normal, profane, secular money wasn't good enough for God. That had to be changed into a proper, acceptable, holy temple currency, obviously at a certain percentage. And the sheep and the cows and the pigeons that in that economy one was expected to sacrifice had to be totally without blemish, and they had to be certified as being without blemish to be good enough for God. And so they'd grown up this economy of selling temple certified animals as suitable for sacrifice, of course at a certain premium over the ones you might normally buy in the marketplace. And Jesus replaces all those mindsets, the idea of the temple as being primarily something that's costly and valuable, the idea of it being an opportunity for money, and that purity mindset of only certain things being good enough for God, with his own self. That, I think, is what's going on, where he talks about destroy this temple in 3 days and I'll raise it up. And they think he's thinking about the temple, but he's talking about himself. Obviously, it's a reference ahead to the crucifixion and the resurrection. But it's also about Jesus making the point that that whole economy and way of thinking about the physical things of God and about money has been replaced by Jesus's own self. He's profane. He gets his hands dirty, doesn't he? He doesn't worry about being ritually clean. We've been hearing all over the Christmas readings about how he's born of a woman. He's a human, physical person with all that implies. He's not some special, holy, set-apart category of man. He's very accessible. He lets himself be accessible to everybody. The temple was organised in a whole series of rooms inside each other. So everyone was allowed into the outer bit, and then only Jews into the next bit, and only men into the next bit, and only priests into the next bit, and so on, until you get finally to the Holy of Holies, where only the one priest who was drawn by lot every month was allowed in. It was a nested series, a bit like Russian dolls, of more and more holy bits that fewer and fewer people were allowed into. And Jesus replaces that with this idea of total accessibility to God. Anyone can talk to him, even a woman, even a sinner, even someone who's a leper. And of course, remember at that point in the crucifixion where the curtain in the temple, we're told, is torn in two. It's symbolic of this total accessibility that Jesus replaces that whole temple economy with. And of course, far from being very valuable and having been under construction for 46 years and taking lots of money to keep up, you know, Jesus' body is just a normal human body, as vulnerable as anyone else's, and completely dispensable as far as the empire is concerned. He goes on, of course, to be crucified because it's a lot better, so they say, for one person to be killed than for there to be upheaval and unrest. So this story really holds together the way in which Jesus' incarnation, crucifixion and resurrection reveal that the economy of God sees total value in the ordinary, the everyday, the human, the lowly, the dirty. In God's economy, things, and particularly people, aren't valued in comparison with each other. There isn't a list of this is more valuable than that. You know, if you're poor, then you bring in 2 pigeons, but otherwise we want a good lamb and that kind of thing. In this economy, everybody and everything is of infinite value. Think back to that creation story. God made everything, and declared that it was good. And that's the context in which any discussion of giving as a holy habit needs to sit. Nobody is valued more or less than someone else because of whether they can give more or less, or whether they choose to give more or less. That's really, really important to say, first of all. In God's economy, everyone is of infinite value. It's hugely countercultural in our society, isn't it? When you see on the front pages of the Daily Mail and even more respected newspapers, you see that, and in our political discourse, you see this constant tendency, if we're not really careful, to value people according to how economically productive they or we are. And it needs constant challenging because it's so easy to fall into that trap ourselves. And I'm sure most of us will have had periods where we've not been working or not been earning very much, and we've felt, is my self-worth, is my value bound up with this? It's really powerful, and it's important to name that and confront it and say that's not part of our Christian value. The other thing that I want to say about Christian giving is that it's not primarily about the needs of the church or the institution. Now, I know we're going to be talking a lot over the years, as we have been doing before, about how we could do with some more money to keep this place going. And of course, next week we're finally putting in our Heritage Lottery Fund bid. But we don't individually give as Christians because the church needs our money. God doesn't need our money. God is God whether or not this church exists, whether or not our gas bill is paid. Giving as a Christian is about our attitude to money, not God's need for it. Remember in the prophets, in Micah and Isaiah, there's all those little bits where the prophets rail against the idea that God needs sacrifices. That's not to say that bringing a sacrifice to the temple wasn't a good thing to do. I think it was very similar to what we're doing when we give our money. It's about our attitude to stuff and things, and choosing to say, actually, us having and accumulating more stuff is not the most important thing in life. But when it becomes about God needing it, that's where there's a problem. God doesn't need burnt offerings and sacrifices or even our hard cash. What God needs is justice and right attitudes. And so any consideration in your own heart or as a church about what we're doing when we give needs to be about giving because we want to, giving out of gratitude for what God has done for us. And because, and I think this is the most important thing, because giving changes our attitude to money. And that's why it's in this Holy Habits Lent series, because there is something about choosing to give to church, to charity, that changes fundamentally our attitude to our money. If we think back to the Ten Commandments, there's no commandment to give. What there is a commandment not to covet what you haven't got. What's really important is our attitude to money. And Jesus goes on and on and on about money. He talks about money more than he talks about anything else. So I know people often don't like talking about money, but we can't get away from the fact that Jesus really did talk about money. And I think because it's so emotional and such an important subject for us that it holds so many of our values. Our attitude to money tends to be quite emotional. I know for me, money holds a lot about security. I'm a bit paranoid about saving for a rainy day and, checking my pension fund and that kind of thing. That's not a good thing. But money can represent all sorts of things to us, and for different people it will be different things. It might be security, it might be our self-worth. Might be our value to society as consumers or generators of wealth. That's what our capitalist society wants us to think, and we have to work really hard against that. Money represents leisure, safety, freedom from fear, freedom from boredom. For a lot of people, money represents freedom from dependency, a kind of sense of independence. And I think Jesus' attitude to money was one of the most revolutionary things he taught. Do you remember that story when people asked Jesus, they were trying to trap him, as they so often did. They asked him whether they thought he should pay taxes to Caesar. And Jesus said, well, give me a coin. So they flipped a coin over to him and he held it up and he said, whose picture's on this? And they said, well, Caesar's. And he says, well, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what's God's. He treated that coin as just a bit of metal that happened to have a picture stamped on it. And that was absolutely revolutionary, because to his audience, that money wouldn't just have meant all the things that it means to us now, food and safety and warmth and freedom from fear. It was also a symbol of a hated, oppressive government. This was the Roman currency that was forced on them. Every time they were forced to use it, they hated the fact that they were having to say, yes, Caesar is our king. And Jesus takes all that emotion out of it and just goes, oh, it's just a bit of metal with a picture stamped on it. It's a phenomenal attitude to money. And one of the things that I really want to challenge us to do is to think, what can we do that would make our attitude to money closer to it's just a bit of paper with a picture on it, rather than having all this emotion tied up with it. Perhaps in all the debates around Brexit, we can get some sort of sense of that emotion about oppression and government that was tied up with a coin at that point where Jesus held that coin. We think about the ink that's been spent on the colour of our passports, and all those decades ago when we were discussing whether to go into the euro or not, the pound sterling was this symbol of us not being governed from Brussels. I mean, I'm not a fan of Brexit, but I think you can get a sense in those arguments about sovereignty and the symbolism of passports and money, just how much emotion is tied up with these things, not because nobody actually cares what colour your passport is, but that whole symbolism and emotion of everything that's involved in it. So what would it take for us to treat money as just metal, just bits of paper with pictures pictured on them? And that, I think, is where giving comes in. I've read quite a lot on the psychology of giving. It's absolutely fascinating. There have been quite a lot of psychological experiments that show that if people pay for something, or pay more for something, they feel more committed to it. And it works in all sorts of weird ways. When I was first working at Procter & Gamble, one of the examples we were given in our initial training course was of a perfume that Procter & Gamble had launched, which didn't do very well, and they were about to drop it after about a year when it had hardly sold anything, when somebody suggested tripling the price. So they repriced it from being £10 a bottle to £30 a bottle, and suddenly they couldn't keep it on the shelves. The way we think about value is really interesting, and the way in which actually things that are more expensive we tend to value more. Now that can be abused, and it has been abused a lot by churches. I'm sure there are people here who have been manipulated by churches into telling them that they ought to give them more because, then God will love them more and so on. But it's also something that once you know the psychology behind it, that we can choose to manipulate ourselves. We can choose to affect what we value by what we do with our money. And we can choose to decide what our values are and then actually put our money against those, because it will make the things that we want to have as values more strongly held. Science tells us that if we literally put our money where our mouth is, we will be more committed to it. We often think that giving in church is something that the really committed people do, but actually the science would suggest that it's actually the other way around. If you give more, you tend to feel more committed. So the question becomes, what do you want to be committed to? And how committed do you want to be? I wonder whether sometimes not giving very much to something is a way of limiting our commitment, either consciously or subconsciously, that actually it would be a bit scary to think that we were totally head over heels into something. But this is why giving is a holy habit, and it's why it's a great thing to think about in Lent, because choosing to put our money somewhere can create and reinforce the values that we want to reinforce. One of the things that I remember Justin Welby saying when he was Bishop in Durham that really stayed with me was that his bank statement was the document that most revealed his theology. And he challenged us, and I challenge you now, to go home and get your bank statement out And depending on how, you might want to get lots of different coloured highlighter pens, you might just want to make notes. But go through it and see where your money actually goes, in categories or lumps. And then think about what that says about your values. Are you valuing most time with friends, say? Are you valuing most outward appearances? Are you valuing most saving for the future? I'm not making any value judgment about what it is that you're spending your money on, but I think very often we spend money without really being aware of what we're doing, don't we? Of course we do. The whole of our shops, the whole of the way that things are designed physically, the whole of our advertising is designed precisely to make us do that. And these people aren't daft. They know exactly what they're doing. I've walked into John Lewis and walked out having spent 60 quid on a skirt. Thought I didn't need another skirt. I just kind of felt the need to make myself buy something. So go through your bank statement, work out where your money goes, and then think, is that actually what your values are? It might be that it is, in which case, great. It might be that actually you realise that you're spending loads of money on something which is not actually that important to you at all. You just kind of get into it because that's where your friends end up taking you, or you've got into a habit of something. And actually there's nothing there on the things that you really do deeply value. So then you can decide, well actually I'll put some little budget lines along this and I will decide consciously to cancel that direct debit and not do that, and instead to do something else. That can be really challenging. It can challenge our most deeply held values. You know, is looking after our family the most important thing? Is having a nice holiday the most important thing? What is important to us? But just seeing whether what your bank statement actually says about your money matches what your deeply held values are can be a really revealing exercise. People often ask, I'm going to preempt the question at the end, well, how much are we meant to give? Because I know there have been lots of places, and if you've been to some more fundamentalist churches, you might have been told you've got to give 10%. I've known churches where they've made you bring your bank statement in and told you how much you should be giving. How terrifying is that? That's a manipulation of that psychology, because once people start doing that, they can't leave. It's very clever. Evil, but clever. We want to use our powers for good, not evil. So I'm putting the power in your own hands to choose what you do. So people will often say things like, you should be giving 10% or no. The Church of England's guide, but of course 10% was effectively the Old Testament temple tax. It was the equivalent of our taxes. It paid for some of the infrastructure that went on. I think the two most useful concepts, and these aren't about actual numbers, and it's partly because 10% is useless. If you're really rich, you should be giving far more than 10%. Because you've got loads of disposable income. If you're really struggling, you can't possibly afford to give 10%. So be sensible. But the two most helpful guidelines, I think, first of all, are the concept of the first fruits. It's an Old Testament concept that the first harvest goes to God. And I do think that's really helpful, actually, that we should choose. I don't like to use the word should. I think it's a really helpful discipline to choose to give to God first, and then use what's left over. Now, whatever you decide that is, I would say organise your bank statement so that goes out on the first of the month. I think that's why planned giving is helpful, because it doesn't mean you're kind of fishing around. Oh, don't you hate it when churches take a collection and you're kind of fishing around and you pull out kind of £1 and 2.20p and stick them on because it's what's left in your pocket. That's not honouring to God and our values. But actually planning and doing and deciding, okay, on the first of the month or the day after pay goes in or whatever, this is how much I'm going to give to God. Doesn't matter how much it is. This is how much I'm going to give to charity. And it goes first, and then I manage on what's left. An amount that I've chosen, but actually I give to God first, not out of what's left over. I think that's a really important concept. And the other is the concept of sacrificial giving, and this comes from thinking about what Jesus did for us. And that actually God has poured out himself in life for the world, in creation, in what Jesus does for us, in everything that's still going on now. And so we're called, if we're responding to that, and I go back to what I said at the beginning, nobody is valued more or less whether or not they're choosing to do this. But we're called, if we want to imitate Christ, if we're wanting to go deeper and deeper into that life of what it might mean for the world, if people choose to live in this radical way, we're called to give in a way that actually does bite into our lifestyle sacrificially. And the best guideline I've seen on that is to think, it was a Church of England leaflet years ago and I thought it was great. Just imagine if what you give in a year, so you might know that you give £10 a week or whatever, or you might need to sort of add it up or just estimate. But if you imagine if what you give in a year was given back to you in a lump sum, whether that's, I don't know, 50 quid or 500 quid or £2,000 or whatever it is, imagine somebody gave you that as a cheque, as a present. Would it be a nice present and you'd go, oh, that's nice, and it would go into the bank, and it wouldn't really make that much difference. You might think, oh, I'll treat myself, but it wouldn't make that much difference to your lifestyle. Or would it actually make a really fundamental difference to your lifestyle and relieve you of some stress or make a difference to how you live day to day? If the amount you were giving when it was given back to you would make a difference, you're giving sacrificially. And if not, you might want to think about potentially doing more. That's the guideline. The other thing people often say is we give in other ways than money. And that is true, of course. We all have time and talents and treasure to give. But I am particularly talking today about our attitude to money. And I think sometimes that is used as a way of avoiding talking about money because money is so emotional for people. And if we think back, often if we've had deprived childhoods or if we've had parents who've had difficult attitudes to money, money can be a really emotional and difficult subject to think about. And I just think just question whether preferring not to think about money is actually about avoiding your attitude to money. Because money is, of course, just a medium of exchange. It's time and talents put into transferable form. It's just a bit of paper with a coin stamped on it, or it's an hour or two of your time that you've earned and saved and can spend again. So I wonder whether if there's something in your mind about not liking money, and not liking talking about money, just question whether, is that because you're undervaluing your own time and you don't think of your time as particularly valuable? Just a question to leave you. Why do we think of money differently when it is basically just our time, our talents in transferable formats? So I think giving is primarily about our attitude to money. And my challenge to you today is to just spend some time, either later on this afternoon or over the coming week, thinking about what your attitude to money is. Which of those emotional responses to money bite for you? What does thinking about giving to charity, giving to God, giving to church mean to you? And if you've got the stomach for it, try the bank statement exercise and just think, what are my deeply held values? Perhaps do that before you get the bank statement out. What are my deeply held values? What do I really value in life? And then just see whether that's where your money's going. Because I think very often our money goes somewhere different to where we actually want our heart to be. And I think where Jesus said, actually, where you put your treasure, there your heart is absolutely right. And we can be pulled by our society in all different ways into our treasure going to prop up the whole capitalist machinery in a way that is not what we really want to be doing, and yet don't necessarily have our consciousnesses raised to say isn't the point. Jesus confronts that commercial mindset, that money-making mindset, and that purity mindset. And he says, actually, do you know what? The profane is good enough for God. Your money is good enough for God. You're good enough for God. And I just want to reiterate, because I have been told that last time someone preached about giving here, someone left the church. Please don't do that. I just want to reiterate, this is not about telling people to give more, necessarily. It's not about telling people that anyone who gives more or less is more or less valuable to God. That's absolutely the opposite of what Jesus came to say. But it is about saying Jesus does challenge us to think about what we do with our money and to challenge our attitude to money and to be sure that we're putting our money where our heart, our value, and where we want the kingdom to be. Amen.